Hello, this is Joel Whitney with the Syracuse University College of Law, and I'd like to welcome you to this edition of the New York State Science and Technology Law Center webcast. Today's webcast is hosted by Shubha Ghosh, the Crandall Melvin Professor of Law and Director of the Technology Commercialization Law Center. Shubha?
Yeah, thank you, Joel, and I'm very pleased to have at Syracuse Law School today Professor Matthew David from Durham University, Department of Sociology. I've known Professor David for a couple of years now. I had the privilege of visiting Durham a few years ago for a conference he put on. And just as a way of a brief introduction, Professor David has written extensively in the area of globalization and intellectual property and challenges to markets and capitalism and property systems that arise from globalization. And he's most recently the author of this book that you see the cover of on the screen, Sharing Crime Against Capitalism. So welcome, Matthew. Hope we have a lively discussion the next hour.
Thank you very much, Shubha. Well, as Shubha says, what I'd like to do is talk about the book. It might be worth pointing out that it is commercially available, but I'm sure you can download various sections of it actually legally and maybe unlegally in other formats. But do go out and buy copies if you'd like, or freely share what you can find. Okay, so what I'd like to do then in the next little while is talk a little bit about sharing in the context of global network capitalism. And the sharing I'm talking about is the sharing of non-rivalous, informational, intangible goods. So content that operates across global digital networks. And in doing so, I'd like to talk a little bit about the paradoxes of global network capitalism in which the possibility of sharing manifests itself. Look a little bit about the expansion of IP protection in the face of the challenge of sharing, the extension of focus or the shift in focus in intellectual property protection that sought to contain sharing, and then in that context look at the arguments in favor and against sharing today, in particular on the issues of efficiency, incentive, and efficacy. I'd like to finally, then at the end, maybe say a little bit about what I mean by sharing and conclude by asking the question, to what extent can sharing challenge capitalism or perhaps simply create a more efficient means for continuing? Okay, so paradoxes of global network capitalism, both paradoxes of globalization, paradoxes of networks, and of capitalism. Obviously, globalization creates the possibility of hyper profitability. If you can outsource the production of goods with reduced labor cost at the same time as protecting intellectual property, then you can increase your profit margins drastically. But on the other hand, globalization facilitates forms of illicit outsourcing, pirate capitalism or counterfeit culture, such that your intellectual property can be circulated worldwide and produced outside your control. So globalization is itself both a potential advantage and a potential threat to profitability. Similarly, global production and distribution networks, on the one hand, can facilitate increased profitability through increased efficiency of production, but global digital networks can also facilitate free counterfeit circulation, challenging profitability. And finally, capitalism itself is intrinsically contradictory with its emphasis on both private property and free markets. In the domain of digital content, the protection of intellectual property is a suspension of markets in the form of intellectual property monopolies. But of course, in a global network world, piracy facilitates the production of new kinds of quasi-markets or pirate markets or criminal markets. So capitalism and its relationship between markets and property is itself paradoxical. Okay, in a context then... In a context then, in a context of intellectual property globalization, we can observe expansion of IP, just as we can observe its increased challenge. So since the 1990s, since the collapse of the Cold War, led by the United States, the World Intellectual Property Organization and the World Trade Organization have sought to increase the geographical space that intellectual property covers, and at the same time increase the duration, the time over which intellectual property monopolies extend. So extension in time and space, but also extension in depth. The boundary between idea and expression has increasingly been pressed such that more and more of what would have once been considered the domain of ideas that cannot be owned have come under the parameter of expression, which can then be copyrighted. Likewise, the distinction between discovery and invention has been blurred as more and more of what would have once been considered the domain of discovery has come under the domain of invention.
So Matthew, what time frame are you thinking about? Are you saying this has occurred in the last 30 years, 20 years? Is this sort of an ongoing process that may go back to colonial period, late 19th, 18th century? Is it?
Well, the time I'm thinking about is particularly for the 1980s onwards. So interesting to note that it was in the 1980s that the United States realized that where it had once been a colonial country that had basically led the world in resisting European copyrights and trademarks, that actually it was itself the greatest producer in the world of intellectual property and was losing market share to Japan, to East Asia, and to Europe, and that its major strength was in intellectual property. So it was at that time in the 1980s that the United States moved from a relatively relaxed attitude to intellectual property towards a much more aggressive regulation and enforcement. And of course, at the end of the 1980s, with the collapse of Eastern Europe, and then in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States sought to extend its advantage in intellectual property across the world through the World Trade Organization, which was set up in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's the time frame I'm thinking about.
So you're thinking largely about these developments occurring from the United States? I mean, where do developments in Europe come in, or even developments in Asia? I mean, the arguments that IP rights in Asia are now becoming kind of more at the forefront. Is that
Well, absolutely. China and India are now becoming major producers of IP and seeking patents and copyrights. But it is, I think, the United States that did lead the world in, for example, the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS Treaty. They were very much driven by the United States. Many of the more recent bilateral and multilateral treaties, the ACTA Treaty, for example, TTIP and TPIP, these were treaties that originate in the United States, trying to bind groups of nations to a model that is favorable largely to the United States. So the United States is the world leader in this domain and has been really since the late 1980s, when it shifted its position from being relatively relaxed and actually quite keen to encourage violations of intellectual property, particularly in developing countries that were allied to themselves. So in order to try and outpace China and the Soviet Union, the United States was quite happy to allow Japan and the Asian tigers to appropriate copyright and particularly patented content. And that shifted really with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Okay, so you see this largely as kind of maybe the impetus really was with post-Cold War. It might have seedlings before then, but it's sort of post-Cold War.
The Cold War ending,
whatever filling that gap is, basically. Yeah.
The threat that the Soviet Union posed ended, and political expedience in needing to enable allies to develop relatively quickly in Europe and in Asia changes with the end of the Cold War. So at that point, the Asian tigers and Europe were basically out-competing the United States in the production of physical goods. And the United States' primary advantage lay in intellectual property, whether it be Hollywood, whether it be Silicon Valley, whether it be in the genetics sector, in the biotechnology sector.
I mean, I guess one of the interesting debates that goes on within the U.S., but it is more global than that, is that there is kind of a divide among industries as to what intellectual property should be. So often that divide is software versus pharma, or maybe more broadly information technologies versus biotech. And then even within information technologies, there's a split between, say Hollywood versus sometimes Northern California versus Southern. So these get divided up in lots of different ways. How does that fit into your theory? Are those just manifestations of just small,
well, there are certainly
detailed debates, or is there something fundamental going on there as well?
Well, the distinctions between fields, such that between pharmaceuticals and computing or film, software, I'd argue those are not intrinsic disputes. The intrinsic dispute, I would argue, is between new technologies and traditional media. So the domain of Hollywood, the domain of the recording industry, recorded music, obviously they consider the technology sector as a major threat. So traditional models of production and distribution see new technologies as opening up new possibilities of distribution and production that basically render them obsolete. So that's in a sense where my interest lies. So when the recording industry blames Silicon Valley for facilitating their demise, the question arises, for me at least, well, is that a problem? So if carrier pigeons or canals might seek to sue telecoms companies or railway lines for putting them out of business, well, I can understand why pigeons would be upset about being put out of jobs by the advent of telephones. Whether in fact society benefits from the continued profitability of the pigeon post, I'd argue is less clear. So my interest then, when I look at issues of efficiency and incentive and efficacy, is to ask the question, well, okay, if there are some traditional sectors run in traditional ways that see new technologies and new sectors rendering them obsolete, do their claims to be compensated? So in academic publishing, for example, publishers claim that the free circulation of journal articles is threatening their business model. Now, the question of whether in fact that's a good thing or a bad thing, the answer to that question depends on whether that existing business model is useful. So that takes me to the question of efficiency and efficacy, which perhaps I could skip forward to now.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, sure.
As I say, we've witnessed various levels of extension, a shift in focus. What used to be a threat from commercial suppliers of counterfeit or pirate content has now shifted to a threat by end users without the intermediaries of commercial pirates. Obviously, we know a little bit about that history. The boom and bust that we saw in music, not quite the same as we see in other sectors, such as live sports broadcasting or cinema, so diverse. An interesting parallel, though, what goes on in copyright might actually start to happen in the domain of pharmaceuticals and trademark with the development of 3D printers.
Just to stop there with that, because we had a little discussion about 3D printing yesterday as well when we did another webinar. So it's a good topic because it's very hot to focus on. And so it seems like one of the big forces in your argument is the development of network information technologies. And so a lot of your focuses have been on the information industries and the entertainment industries. And I think what you're suggesting with 3D printing is that it might go to manufacturing, go to products, go to different different spaces, including medicine. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, on how you see that working? Would it be working pretty much the same way that once we can reduce these things to digital form and then they can be moved very quickly, then that's very hard to control? Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. If 100 years ago or 200 years ago, if you wanted to have a copy of a piece of sheet music, you had to find somebody who could manufacture sheet music to give you a pirated copy. 100 years ago, if you needed to get a copy of a piece of recorded music, you needed a manufacturer who could make you, whether it be the lawful copy or the pirated copy. Today, for example, in the domains of pharmaceuticals or in the domains of designer goods, if you want to buy the lawful product, you buy it from a manufacturer. If you want to buy an unlawful product, you have to buy it from a manufacturer. The only question is whether or not the manufacturer is the copyright or patent or trademark holder or not. Of course, in the domain of purely intangible goods, so that's film, music, software, television, etc., nowadays it's possible to bypass the manufacturer and get copies from other copies. So you just make digital copies. That basically undoes much of the regulative force in the domain of copyright, but the domain of patent, trademark, etc., of course, still has the physical good that you can't yourself make until now. And of course, in the future, if it is the case that you can basically download a Gucci handbag in much the same way that today you can download a film or a song, and bear in mind, 20 years ago, to download a film might take you all night on your...
No, but that's changed.
Yeah. So basically...
Changes. I guess one difference, though, is the tangibility. I mean, one of the aspects of digitizing music or even digitizing a film is that the quality often can get better than the analog version. So putting aside the issue of ebooks, but ebooks really is about functionality rather than quality per se. I mean, there's still something nice about having the nice leather-bound volume in your hand, but if I try to search for a passage, it's easier if I have the ebook to find out where that exact quote is. And it's largely about functionality, so there's that aspect of quality. But putting that aside, if you think about the sound quality of a sound recording, of musical work, or even of the visual quality of a movie, digitization is really, kind of a leap forward, right? So the question I'm getting to is, can you really make a Gucci bag in your basement that's as going to be good as you can get even as a knockoff on the street corner? In other words, isn't there just this fundamental problem of the materiality of the product that is going to be very hard for anybody to really capture or even improve on?
Well, in 1935, the first outside broadcast of the British BBC of sports coverage, they broadcast the Wimbledon tennis final. And I think the reason that Wimbledon, up until very recently, insisted that players wear white clothes is because in 1935, the television recording was such bad quality that you couldn't see the ball and you couldn't see the people except for the little blurring white blobs that were the people. So, 80 years ago, television was very, very poor quality.
Yeah.
When digital recordings of music first became available, the MP3 format, the compression format that enabled files to be shared on the internet was very, very low quality. When live streaming of music first, of live sports coverage in the early 2000s was first kind of available to internet users, it was commonly observed that you couldn't see the ball. You'd see little figures running around in various colors, but you couldn't really see the ball. And the argument was always that the quality of the pirated content was inferior to the quality of the proprietary content. And over time, that argument has basically disappeared.
Sure.
Now, in relation to tangible goods, with 3D printers, of course, nowadays, what most people could download from a 3D printer or construct using a 3D printer would be very rudimentary by comparison. To download a Swiss watch or to download a Gucci handbag wouldn't be of particularly high quality. But in the same way that 20 years ago, a downloaded music file, people would say, well, you can't hear the words and the quality is very low, and you couldn't do this for classical music. You can only do it for kind of relatively simple forms of music. So that will change. And also bear in mind that Gucci no longer make their handbags in little Parisian atelier sort of workshops. They're mass produced in China in very modest quality at a very high price, but the quality of the production is an interesting auto-tarnishment that trademark protects a manufacturer from other people making their product if that manufacturer doesn't want them to make their product. But actually, auto-tarnishment is where a manufacturer who has the right to make a product outsources it to a low-quality producer. So, for example, Porsche now outsource their logo to make sunglasses that aren't particularly high quality, that would never be passed by the Porsche manufacturer in Germany. But Porsche decided that they could actually market that quality, so of that low-quality product under their name. So it goes both ways, that the quality of knockoff products has improved, and the quality of a lot of proprietary products has actually declined. Of course, the overall, again, the quality of production is another theme in pharmaceuticals. It's often argued that the proprietary product, the medicine that you buy from a lawful patent holder, will be superior to a counterfeit product that may be made by criminals. And that is very often true. Auto parts or airplane parts that are counterfeit are very often of a lower quality. But if you compare that to generics, the generics market isn't necessarily producing drugs of a lower quality, and actually the generics market undermines the market for counterfeits and therefore improves the overall quality of production for consumers.
I guess I was thinking, at least in the context of 3D printing, not so much about counterfeits or illegal products or unauthorized products versus authorized, because as you suggest, the market for quality is a complicated one. I mean, that's what you're suggesting. My thought is more that, on the one hand, digitization has led to copies that are better often than what would be analog, comparisons. And so where a lot of the value added is not so much in the content, but in the hardware. So there's the next generation of smart TVs is what you want to have, and people do that turnaround and then try to get the technology wars are at the hardware level. My thought is with 3D printing that the analog would be that it's with the materials in order to be able to get the best kind of materials that you feed into the 3D printer. Gucci, whoever these designers are, will really spend a lot of time putting money into that. And then meanwhile, for those who want to just make this at home, the battle would be over better quality 3D printing, but also better quality materials. So
that'll be interesting.
I think the broader question is, to get back to your book, the sharing economy is going to have a role, but there's always going to be this sort of battle against the proprietaries. It's just going to shift, right?
Well, I mean, a number of examples in the domain of computer games, for example, the ready accessibility and availability of relatively new software games, they're within 6 months.
Right.
One generation will be out of date, but the software industry has focused on platforms. So you buy the Xbox.
That's a good example. Right, exactly.
You buy the kind of the thing that's going to give you the graphics card, that's going to give you the faster kind of processing power that's specific for a gaming console. The PC revolution in computing has kind of been replaced now. What used to be sort of arcades in buildings, then there was the PC revolution. That sort of faded. And then the games providers have found a niche in what they believe audiences will pay for, at the same time as creating space for a huge pirate market, which doesn't necessarily threaten them.
I mean, the interplay between the sharing market, the sharing economy, as you describe it, and this kind of proprietary economy is interesting. I mean, I guess the question is whether hardware itself will ever. I mean, if you view that as a hardware-software battle, which it is in part, I know that's not totally the case, but if you kind of look at that as kind of a starting point, I'm not sure how the sharing model will enter into the hardware. That's where IP may be very resilient to any kind of change in the way that it has been in the software. So just give me an example. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, for example, in the video game market, there was a lot of concern about consumers and users taking the game and creating new levels, or making the software less proprietary, open source, whatever. And a lot of video game developers have sort of allowed that functionality to come into play to basically make that part of the product. I don't necessarily see that having at hardware. There's a lot of battles on the hardware front. I'm not denying that. I mean, there are a lot of people who hack in. I mean, there's a big Sony hack. I mean, Sony is just and part of that is kind of resisting the way in which hardware has become more proprietary. So I guess how does that fit into your story about the sharing economy? I mean, one way to kind of read the book, which is a great book, is that the sharing economy is always going to be there. We can look historically as to what its roots were, but just looking at the present, it's there. But it's always going to be kind of this point of resistance.
Well, very interesting to know where the sharing of content relates to the platforms and the physical architecture. Because if we think about, for example, the internet itself as the base network structure that sharing occurs through, much of the physical infrastructure is in the private sector. And yet the platform, sort of the web, is itself a non-proprietary object. The World Wide Web Consortium prohibits private ownership of the base code on which it operates. The internet, similarly, is not a private sector organization. The platform necessarily requires a degree of open source or non-proprietary control, even as some of the physical wiring is in private hands. Yes, I mean, how these things play out in terms of people buying physical products, as in the latest computers with the highest bandwidths and the fastest speeds and processing capacity, that's at the current time very much in the proprietary domain. My focus in this content, at least this book, is in the area of non-proprietary
where the sharing is possible.
Content. Right? So it's the intangible content. But that does create space for the selling of physical infrastructure and physical objects. On your point about products and their relative quality, interesting to note that the theme of auto-tarnishment, a lot of proprietary content is not particularly high quality. So in the trademark domain, the quality of the product is relatively diminished by the fact that you're trading on the brand name. So you're trading on the image rather than the substance, the sort of empty signifier. So if the consequence of 3D printers being able to enable you to make your own Ralph Lauren shirt with its the 3D printer can help you make that. Well, if that forces the companies to start producing quality product that differentiates them from the free shared downloaded version, then that may be a good thing. But as at the current time, one of the reasons that the proprietary models facilitate the free sharing is that they don't necessarily produce superior product. The computing games industry is an interesting example where the threat of free sharing facilitates rapid innovation. Rather than reliant on intellectual property, the gaming industry simply has to develop new product. So the fact that they invent new versions of each product every 6 months means that 70-year copyright is of no meaning. They don't rely on copyright. They rely on the fact that they develop something that's better, that is nicer for the user than the product they invented 6 months ago, which is freely available, but users choose to buy the proprietary product if it's better.
Interesting.
Which in all cases isn't not always true. But anyways, so my question then is, as on Shubha's point, this question, well, is a sharing economy more efficient, more incentivizing, and more effective in providing utility to users? And I've run through a few examples to try and make my case. So we think about the production of drugs. We're routinely told that the private sector requires high prices on patented goods in order to repay the cost of drugs innovation. And that simply isn't true. As Bolden and Levine in their book Against Intellectual Monopoly argue, 2/3 of pharmaceutical research funding comes from the state, charity, and non-commercial university sector. Most of the research that goes on in the private sector is post-clinical and clinical trials, which are 2 to 4 times more expensive than if they were conducted in the public sector. And what work is done in the private sector is to a large extent Me Too and catch-up research, trying to reverse engineer existing patented products so that a commercial rival can produce its own patented product without infringing on its commercial rival's existing patents. So not intrinsically innovative, but simply trying to produce parallel copies of other people's patented content. So basically, patent thickets don't incentivize. Patents are not the primary driver of innovation, and actually the private sector is less efficient than the public sector in this domain. Likewise,
can we talk about, because I think it really is an interesting, I think your paper, or rather your book, focuses on, as you say, the network information. And so drugs don't immediately fall into that. There are ways that I'd like to get into that do touch upon this sort of network information system. Drugs still have a rivalrous nature to them since they're physically a pill. Obviously, the information in the drugs is where a lot of the battle is, and that's where I think some of your arguments about sharing, can come into play. But I wanted to talk about this. One of the criticisms of intellectual property, especially patents in the pharmaceutical area, is that it tends to channel incentives towards designer specialized drugs. They're orphan diseases, they're orphan, lots of things that just really there isn't the focus on that should be. And that's an argument that you can take apart in some ways and look at. How would a notion of sharing address that question? Or is it, one way the two arguments fit together is to say that the incentives argument, which is the argument you're making, that the incentives argument really misses the point. But at the same time, there are arguments that we need to have better incentives for companies to look at orphan drugs. And so there have been ways to do that, like prizes and things like that. But how would sharing help in that?
Well, rather than saying that private companies need to have better incentives, I think the recognition that actually greater efficiency occurs in the public sector, whether it be universities, a non-profit, or whether it be in government-funded research in various kind of, and that can sometimes be in commercial laboratories with tax breaks and various kind of incentives. So I don't think it is the commercial sector that has to be incentivized, because they're not necessarily the most effective producer of end products. The question of where incentives are directed, so where states focus. I'll talk a little bit later about in relation to the recent Ebola outbreak in the world, that this was an orphan drug, an orphan kind of disease that people weren't focusing on because it wasn't affecting relatively affluent people. And it was the public sector that had to step in and actually encourage commercial companies to fast-track clinical trials because they wouldn't have otherwise done that. And again, it's an interesting question as to where does the sharing come from? Well, okay, if it's publicly funded, that's one conception of sharing. But likewise, the free sharing of the intellectual property or what would emerge from that research, that it is made available for other researchers to work with, for generic manufacturers to make relatively cost-effective copies that can be circulated to patients around the world without the high cost and inhibitions of monopoly rents. So a number of different mechanisms can be put in place. I guess my point is that the proprietary model of protecting intellectual property in pharmaceuticals research is not a particularly efficient way of incentivizing or of producing innovation.
Yeah, another research, and I think people would recognize that there's a public sector and private sector partnership is a little bit strong word, but there's a symbiotic relationship in terms of just basic research and how that then feeds into products. I mean, the problem with universities developing these drugs, beyond the basic research, of course, is that they're not in a position to get into the pharmaceutical business. I mean, they're not going to suddenly set up factories. And if governments do it, you get into capacity problems. And of course, industry can't always. I mean, we talk about it's flu season here, and then a few years ago, I haven't looked at it this year. I mean, there's always problems in having the capacity to make the flu vaccine that comes up. And so those are questions. I'm not sure if sharing directly addresses it, but I think what you're getting at is thinking about different types of institutional arrangements beyond just simply the profit motive. But then, I think those exist already. But
the suspension of intellectual property would enable manufacturing across the world. It would enable the development of generics in markets across the world that can't gain access. The question
maybe some sort of compulsory licensing. Maybe we still get into these basic, there are still scarcity issues in terms of.
And as you rightly observed, the domain of pharmaceuticals is not yet fully intangible in the sense that it requires physical manufacture. The development of 3D printers down the line and the development of manufacturing technologies down the line may actually mean that these things become much easier to make in diverse locations. I guess my focus at the present time is actually about the production of the drug in its first instance. So how these drugs developed, how are they made available, how are they tested, and I'd argue that it's actually in the non-proprietary environment that's actually most best.
Yeah, I haven't read the book or watched the movie. I should. Maybe I'll do that this week if I have time. Called Lorenzo's Oil, where you did. I don't know if you've seen that. About it was I think it was a parents whose child had, I forget what disease it was, and they. Obviously the story. There's a lot of things that are embellished, but it's a true story where they were able to kind of come up with their own types of therapies based upon their own studies. Somebody who did have a scientific background. I guess it gets kind of dangerous when you have anybody who starts doing, and that gets to my next point. I mean, where I think the one aspect of the network technologies come into play, the information in the pharmaceutical sector, is the sharing of information about healthcare. I mean, because in the background to all of this, you still have just sort of basic questions about how healthcare is going to get distributed. I mean, there's a profit motive that certainly in the U.S. and you can talk a little bit about the U.K. experience.
I mean,
the example I gave is in India. India has a very thriving generic drug sector, but it's all pay for service. I mean, it's not. There's no health insurance. There's no public health insurance in India. I mean, so even though you do have a generic sector, there still are issues about access to drugs and access to health care that arise. And so the network system is helpful in terms of maybe providing information about the efficacy of these drugs, about one area called functional medicine, where they're looking beyond just simply the pop-up pill view of treatment. Look at nutrition, look at other types of things, lifestyle type things. And so that's kind of important because the medical establishment, if you will, whatever the healthcare system doesn't necessarily push that because there's not much money in that. So, I mean, this is just, again, the complications of these interplays kind of interesting.
Well, it's certainly true that generic medicine wouldn't necessarily make everybody able to afford medicine. And the question of health services, whether it be state-supported or Medicare type supported or private sector supported, I mean, that would be a different question. But having said that, one of the arguments for the difficulties in contemporary medicine is the sheer price. I mean, in the UK, tens of billions of pounds a year are spent out of government funds on buying back drugs that at patent prices, and that's not money I think is actually well spent. It's not an effective model. No, but
anyway, it's just interesting to think about the different dimensions of sharing. I wanted to talk about that because your book, excuse me, I keep saying paper, but the book, touched on so many different, and that's what's so really interesting about the book is the pervasiveness of these issues. It's not just about downloading music.
And sharing also, if you think in the development of pharmaceutical products, one of the recent difficulties is that actually the time taken to develop new drugs is actually taking longer and longer because researchers are hamstrung by the fact that so much of what's out there is not available to be used. So it's difficult for researchers to share work, to work on each other's work. That actually one of the wellsprings of scientific innovation is free access to the work of others. And we'll get to that in the discussion of incentive. But again, it's a dimension of sharing which facilitates scientists to actually do their work. But anyways, that's, as you rightly say, currently you can't simply download medicine off the internet. So it is more the ideas that need circulating freely. And in the future, maybe 3D printers will make them accessible directly as well. Obviously, an area where digital content is more readily manifest is in software, where I would argue open source hackers and programmers have systematically demonstrated an ability to outperform commercial software products. For example of Apple's Fair Play. So iTunes no longer has any encryption precisely because Apple couldn't compete with hackers in the maintenance of their encryption software. Likewise, as I've mentioned, the World Wide Web and file sharers have been good examples of the creation of platforms based on sharing principles that actually are more efficient and effective than lots of little silos, little commercial silos. Similarly, in the distribution of music, it's very difficult to argue that the traditional music industry model, where artists gave up 85% of their net sales to companies for the company to provide production, manufacture, distribution, and management, and then to pay a significant, in parts, almost all, in fact, sometimes more than all of that remaining 5 to 15% back to their record companies for the production, distribution of marketing and management costs. So most musicians who have record contracts actually end up owing money to their record companies. So in that context, free circulation of content via the internet is by far and away a more efficient mechanism of distribution. And I would argue in relation to its production, artists who perform live, whose fans don't pay for recorded content, have more money to go to see them in concert, and consequently ticket prices and ticket sales have actually increased. So actually the best way to get paid is to give it away for free. That's, I think, a well-established fact in the music industry. And as I mentioned already, in relation to generics, I think we've already touched on this theme.
That's a two-way street, right? I guess, the example that comes to mind is the Beatles performing, the Let It Be on top of was it on top of the Apple II, wherever it was.
Yeah,
so that's just giving the performance away for free in order to sell the content. Right?
Well, so it is the case that the Beatles are the paradigmatic case of a recording artist. So the idea that an artist, the Beatles in 1966, they gave up live performance because of the personal issues, Brian Epstein's death, and the fact they couldn't hear themselves sing. So people were screaming, and the sound amplification was so weak that they couldn't hear themselves sing when they were on stage. So they stopped performing, and they went into the studio. They started to produce the Sgt. Pepper album, and that album, along with the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, those are the iconic concept albums. And that notion of the recording artist, the person who's in the studio, detached from their fans, making their living from recording, it sits in that example, the Beatles and the Beach Boys, in a very short moment in time. They are a kind of an example of a successful band that made a lot of money from recording, but not after 1966 from touring. That's true. In the current climate, that's just no longer the case. That actually the way to get paid now is to perform. Interestingly, the parallel case to the Beatles is the Rolling Stones, who continue to tour even to this day, made vastly more from their concerts than they do from their music sales, despite the fact that they're one of the best-selling recording artists of all time. They still make more money from live performance, and actually they make more money from live performance precisely because their fans don't necessarily have to go out and buy their recorded content. But the case of the Beatles is an interesting one. It's set up as the sort of, you would argue that today's emphasis on live music means you could never have another Sgt. Pepper. And that's true. But then again, if you did have another Sgt. Pepper, why would that be original? It's not. The Beatles are a particular moment in time. The technology that was used, the studio that produced the Sgt. Pepper album was revolutionary at its time, but it's now, that's an historical moment. Just as Mozart was able to write down music in a way that was revolutionary at the time when he did so, Bach before him. There have been revolutions in music, but to say that we should harken back to the Beatles today, well, they were a moment in time that we cannot recreate. And if we did, we'd only be reinventing the past, and that would hardly be creative.
But I guess, there is, this is not so much about Common One, so much about the Beatles. It's just the way in which the symbiotic relationship between, in this case, public performance and selling the commodity of the recording. But the public performance, the performance is also commodified, right? In other words, the ticket prices are fairly high, and there are restrictions when you go in about recording, making your own recording. I know, maybe some bands like the Grateful Dead come to mind, and there may be others that do allow recording by fans and then distribution of those recordings. But it seems like those also are still controlled, right? So there is still this element of IP that even comes up with performance rights. And there are anti-bootlegging statutes, there are treaties and so forth. And so, again, it seems very hard to say that it's really a pure sharing economy.
It would be entirely false to say that it was a purely sharing economy. A curious fact of live performance in the world today is that as the world becomes globally connected, what becomes valuable is the locally regulated space. So a performance space where, as you say, you can only get in if you pay, becomes a valued thing because only so many people can go to it. And then you get some kudos from having been to an event that others haven't been to. You've got a unique experience, you and the 10,000 other people that were having that unique experience.
Or you do the broadcast rights, and that's, again, very proprietary.
Right. Well, so there are issues of proprietary rights that go on, performance rights, all the kind of reproduction rights from live performances. But the interesting thing, I think, on the one hand, that the artist can make more money now from live performance than was the case in the past. And secondly, if you can't afford to go to the live concert, you can gain the content for free by other means. Now, that doesn't mean that the world is equal. Everyone has equal access to everything. But the sharing economy facilitates a wider level of access than would have once been the case. It actually rewards artists better than was once the case. And it enables the fans to gain access to a wider range of content than was ever previously the case. So it's absolutely true that companies like Live Nation, they've flourished in an age of live performance, and they are very good business people, and they're capitalist in their incentive. But that an artist can make more now from their live performance in the form of labor, as opposed to the mythical model. But the Beatles, they did make money from capital. They turned their records into capital that could be reproduced and sold as copies, rather than live labor, as in doing a job and getting paid for that performance. That has shifted. The shift between capital and labor has shifted in favor of the artist that performs rather than the records. But that's not to say that it's abolished capitalism. It certainly hasn't. It simply means that labor is rewarded slightly better than it once was. But that's certainly not, in all cases, true, and it certainly hasn't abolished capitalism. In the physically rivalrous domain, as you say previously, with the actual computer hardware, or in the case of the hardware that is the physical place, the live event, the place, the stadium that are being built and that are being constructed with gates on the front to basically make it proprietary.
And the owner of the concert venue, that's a really interesting dynamic as well, as to whether it's the municipality that owns it or if it's privately owned, in terms of how that's allocated.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
So yes, just a final case in point of efficiency in the publishing domain. If you think that 50 years ago it took 10 years for the footage of Abraham Zapruder's filming of the assassination of John F. Kennedy to reach the public, Life magazine bought it up and then withheld it from the public for 10 years. Contrast that in 1991 when George Holliday filmed the beating of Rodney King. It took about 10 days or so before that reached the public. Then in the Asian tsunami of 2004, it was a matter of, well, live people actually broadcasting, in some cases, their own deaths as citizen journalists. And then, more recently still, the killing of Colonel Gaddafi in 2011, the news was actually filmed and released and distributed by the people who are actually making the news, in this case, shooting President Colonel Gaddafi.
Yeah, just one comment about the Zapruder film. It gets fairly complicated with that, but I understand what you're getting at. And there was a very famous lawsuit involving the copyright in the Zapruder film that actually came out under fair use. Actually, it's one of these last fair use cases before the 1976 Copyright Act, and that makes it interesting. I think part of the delay also, I may be wrong about this, but as I understand it, is it was evidence of a federal crime. I think one of the reasons why it wasn't publicly available, other than just kind of and maybe the copyright issues, but also the public sensitivities at the time.
Absolutely.
And also the fact that it was evidence. It was, it's a little bit more complicated.
As with more recent cases, and I think 2 years ago in the United States, where a reporter and her cameraman were shot dead by a former and disgruntled employee. These cases of unmediated media should not be taken as evidence because they're more efficient, that they're any necessarily morally superior.
Sure.
They raise interesting questions as to if we can see a trajectory of greater and greater efficiency in the release of news and events and imagery, far in excess of the efficiency of mainstream media forms, which journalists are sent to places where news events have happened, often to kind of cover the cleanup or cover the official statements released by official agencies, etc. A very inefficient way of accessing content.
Well, I guess one way to think about this is it's an efficient way to get at the underlying data. But, there's always this question. I have had this comes up in some of the classes I teach, maybe more in copyright, but also in general information policy, the relationship between data, information, and knowledge. So we can get ready access to data, but we may not have the interpretive filters that allow us to understand what the informative content is of that data. And then the next level of understanding is that of knowledge, which is more of a... And so it seems like what we're left with, and this picks up on a point that somebody raised, of course, at the faculty meeting as far as the faculty discussion we had earlier, this kind of filtering, review, peer review, whatever it might be. We're each sort of faced with data. We each have to make our judgments, and then the world of information and knowledge may just be kind of scattered at this point.
Well, it is the case that there's a difference between information and knowledge. To say that the greater efficiency in the distribution of information intrinsically is at odds with the development of knowledge implies, I think, that we can trust the old and existing filters. So if it were the case that Life magazine made a decision regarding the release of the Zapruder film, whether or not we consider that to be censorship, who is it that makes those decisions? Can we trust the intermediaries? So traditional media, whether it be in the case of the UK, the Sun...
You don't necessarily have to trust, sorry to interrupt, you don't necessarily have to trust the intermediary. I'm not suggesting that by any means, but you can at least assess the intermediary. So if you know it's Life magazine that's saying this versus the National Review saying it or reporting it, the information, you can assess that, and depending upon your own proclivities or your own sense of those two publications, you can then make your own judgment, which may fall in the realm of knowledge or may fall in the realm of just judgment, whatever it might be.
And that's still true.
Yeah,
and that's still true. So, for example, if the shooting of Colonel Gaddafi gets put on the front page of the Sun, then you can evaluate whether or not you believe it, depending on what you believe about the Sun and what you believe about its editorial policy. That's not changed. I think, interestingly, we've had a recent discussion in the UK and the US about fake news and the susceptibility of the population to supposed sort of impact of the internet on bubbles, etc. I don't know that that's really quite fair. The censorship and ideological composition of news filters has been long-standing. It wasn't always the case that we could make ready judgments as to the truth and veracity of the claims that were being presented to us by various intermediaries. The question for us today, where we have a more efficient distribution of content. We can gain access to content more readily and more quickly. The question of how we adapt, the question of how we decide our own filters, how we may choose to create new kinds of filtering, as we were saying in the discussion earlier, as academics, we often engage in peer review in the attempt to evaluate the quality of our own data. The data becomes readily available more quickly because we can use digital methods of access to content. We still are required to make those judgments. Whether we do go ahead and create new forms of filtering, or whether we rely on traditional publishers, traditional news outlets, traditional news broadcasters, traditional media, basically, is one we have to decide. And I suspect we have to find ways of finding new filters we can trust. But that will probably require some level of peer-to-peer self-creation rather than reliance on traditional forms of network nexus, where effectively you have an editorial nexus, and the editorial nexus is controlled by whether it be the state or whether it be by commercial interests. And that's true of Google with its search algorithms, or Fox News, or Putin's latest venture to try and take over Sputnik TV or rebrand Sputnik TV in the UK.
Or to go back to your drugs example, which I think is a really interesting one, and maybe worth another book on your part too to go, because I think it's really interesting. Do you rely on WebMD? Do you rely on the Food and Drug Administration? Do you rely upon? And then there's obviously a lot of, again, fake news there. You think about the anti-vaxxers, the anti-vaccine rhetoric in the U.S. Not just simply rhetoric. I mean, people act on it to the detriment of society, in my opinion. And then maybe there's similar things at the UK, but again, with medical and scientific information, it's really interesting. I mean, I think the sharing economy aspect for the network information is not just about entertainment, right? It's not just about these types of images and these types of examples, but it's really interesting to think about how it affects, the scientific information and scientific knowledge.
And it makes us have to reflect on what we think is acceptable at the level of peer review. There's evidence that commercial interests can interfere with peer review. Commercial interests and state interests can interfere with clinical and post-clinical trials. It's not the case that we can rely on our own assumption that, well, we have peer review because we publish in academic journals. There are examples of corruption and weakness in our own practice and performance. There are good examples in the domains such as in Wikipedia. There's good examples of peer co-production, whether it be in a range of domains in hacking in terms of software production, free and open source software production, user-generated content in a number of software domains, that we have to learn to deal with production in a more efficient way as data becomes more readily available. So that's a challenge.
And assessment. Production, distribution, and assessment, right? I mean, that's sort of
But initially, do we do that at the level of sharing in the form of some kind of peer mechanisms, or do we assume that an authority above us can tell us what we should be thinking, what we should be buying? Well, that's an interesting question. Because science considers itself an authority, it's interesting insofar as its own authority is based on its own assumption about peer self-assessment and non-reducibility to commercial publishers or to commercial pharmaceutical companies. But of course, commercial publishers and commercial pharmaceutical companies have a significant impact on the way that we academics do our work. So it's a very challenging environment.
We have about 10 minutes left, so we've got room to discuss. But I think this is a point I do want to raise, because I think that's interesting, is that not just simply in your book on sharing, but just the concept of sharing as it exists in policy discussions and in scholarship like yours. I mean, my criticism of the term sharing is that it's still very consumerist oriented, that it's all about, as I said, downloading music as being the archetypal example of sharing, but it's still about consumption. And I don't mean production in the sense of where the information comes from. I mean, I go back to this use of the word assessment. I mean, maybe we can think about it as critical consumption and critical reading. But sure, go ahead.
Sorry, move us forward. I mean, if we think of in the domain of production, in academic research, in research in pharmaceuticals, whether in medicine, in all across the scientific fields, is actually sharing is the core driver. That actually giving your content away, ensuring that it gets received and used by others, is actually it's not a altruistic thing. We get cited, we get hired based on the fact that we give our content away.
Sure.
So I wouldn't say that sharing is just in the domain of distribution, as in once it's made, we can distribute it freely online. No, actually it's the driver that actually facilitates the production in the domain of music, in the domain of software, in the domain
Absolutely,
of medical research, in the domain of scientific research, and also, I'd say, in publishing, as I pointed out earlier, 3,000% in the late 20th century. By now, 10,000% increase in the price of academic journals for no benefit to the actual distribution within the academic community. We can share that content. We produce the content, we edit the content, we peer review the content, we are the judges and the makers, and yet that content is sold, well, not even sold, it's given away to commercial intermediaries who sell it back to us at 13% increased price every year for 45, 47 years. It offers no particular advantage to us, but we pay back such vast increases in price. In the domain of book publishing, again, is it true that the production of content, original works, is incentivized by strong intellectual property? And I'd argue it wasn't. Since the United States joined the Berne Treaty in 1988, huge concentration of publishing companies to the point where those making minimum wage from publishing has kind of dwindled into a matter of a few hundred in the world. It's a shot, and those are people primarily producing relatively formulaic big books, celebrity chefs, pot boilers, repeaters. It's not a particularly effective and efficient model. For those people engaged in production of fiction and trade non-fiction, the incentives are usually that they find an audience, and the audience pays to come and see them live. They do talks, they do ghostwriting or journalism or teaching or various other things. The IP model doesn't really act as their primary incentive. It does for a very tiny number of people, but you ask the question, are those people, the Dan Browns and the J.K. Rowlings, they're not necessarily the most creative artists. And if you go back 100 years to Shakespeare or through up to Dickens, because they actually became famous because their works were given away outside of their control, and yet they got paid by live performance in both cases, in different ways. But anyways, so I have made that case for efficiency and efficacy and incentive. But your point then about sharing, I think, is a good one, that sharing can mean many things to many people, and in that sense you can have your cake and eat it by jumbling too many different things up in the concept of sharing. And I agree that has to be unpacked, but in what I'm trying to do in looking at the copying and free circulation of non-rivalous, in other words, intangible goods, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about shares, stocks and shares, sharing out, shearing, power shares, whatever. I do try and focus on a specific meaning. But I would argue that there is a divergence in the meaning of sharing in two dimensions. One, horizontal peer sharing. So we as academics might share our work amongst ourselves, but we wouldn't want that content to be freely circulated. Actually, I think I would. But there might be a concern that if content is freely available, then where would the incentive be to produce it? Likewise, whether it be artistic influence, authors, poets listening and reading one another, citizen journalism, software, user-generated content. There are communities of producers, peer producers, rather similar to Malinowski's discussion of the Kula circle in the Trobriand Islands. So you've got communities that circulate within themselves. And of course, however, that can be contrasted to what Mauss criticized Malinowski for, that it's not just about sharing at a sort of peer-to-peer reciprocation level. It's kind of redistribution, where that which is produced by one person is then shared out to everyone else, which might then undermine the incentive. So, if you're producing something in your group of co-producers, but I'm coming along and taking copies of it, where then would be the incentive? And that's the threat, that sharing could mean both things. And whilst one might be quite dynamic, in that poets listen to another, authors listen to another, musicians listen to another, but someone then has to pay them. But if it's redistributed for free, then no one's paying them. Well, I would argue from the cases that I've given that actually the redistribution model doesn't fundamentally undermine the kind of reciprocation between peers, that actually they reinforce one another. And therefore, I'd argue that sharing is actually a more incentivizing, more efficient, and a more effective mechanism than either markets or proprietary control in the domain of
Right. And I guess there might be even a third model of sharing, which is, without, for lack of a term, maybe a better term at the moment, is something like an infrastructure model. In other words, you think about having the air in this room, or there's just something, whatever the underlying technology, if you will, it's just natural that the atmosphere in this room is not something we can control necessarily fully, or the sunshine, right? or you gave the example, you had the famous quote from Thomas Jefferson about the taper, right? Yep. And so the question then is, how do you develop that type of both physical, cultural, and then maybe intangible infrastructure? I mean, for example, knowledge would be an example of sort of an intangible infrastructure.
I don't know that you'd need to develop them, because I would argue that they have been developed. That actually, in the domain,
they exist, right?
In the domain of academic content, we do actually engage readily in the sharing of our work. In pharmaceutical research, the scientific researchers doing the research, not necessarily the companies that own that research when it's done, are usually very willing to share that content. Jessica Silby, in her book, The Eureka Myth, documents very interestingly that how creative workers, whether it be in pharmaceuticals or in authorship or in poetry or music, they are actually, they have infrastructures of sharing that already exist, but they are constrained by commercial, market and proprietary limits, sometimes on their own desire to make content available. So I think the infrastructure exists, but you're right that there's an infrastructure of production, which sharing, I think, is the most efficient and effective means of facilitating. And then there is the mechanism of distribution. But again, that in large measure exists. Of course, in the domain of intangibles, it very much exists in the form of downloading and streaming online. With the advent of 3D printers and their extension, that might itself extend such that in the future the ready distribution of medical and other kind of trademark content might be shared freely as well. Of course, when you achieve a society where that level of scarcity has been abolished, so basically intangible and large measures of tangible content are readily available in a non-scarce environment, it's very difficult for a system based on prices and property to be maintained. That's not to say that capitalism can't invent new things for us to want, or new ways for which we pay to get it. But as I would perhaps conclude,
please. I'm sorry.
Whilst the two possibilities exist for it's actually to maintain proprietary control requires policing everywhere, always, and in everything. So everyone, everywhere, all the time. And that's actually very, very difficult. The last 30 years, what makes it seem as though capitalism is very strong is that it's actually had to be regulated and enforced. So more and more treaties, more and more kind of agreements, more and more forms of regulation in what's supposed to be a globally free market. And actually, that policing of the world is very difficult to sustain. And whilst it exists, it's not necessarily working. And whether it can be sustained is, again, a matter for some dispute.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for taking the time to visit us. I'm glad you were able to do this. I hope you found it enjoyable. I really enjoyed the book. I don't know if we show the copy of the book again. I don't know if we have the slides, but it's appearing backwards. But sharing from Holiday, right? Cambridge, is it?
Yeah. That's in Cambridge. Yes, it is.
So
download it if you can find it.
Yeah, download it. Yeah.
So buy it if you'd like.
Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you.
Bye.